So during theme week, I've done 2 videos on the Canadian Grand Prix, with Wednesday's video being about the 1995 Canadian Grand Prix, which was done 30 years to the day after that particular event, which is good timing. But this weekend will also be the Le Mans 24 Hours, arguably the most famous, grandest, historic and most prestigious endurance race of them all. Sorry Nürburgring fanboys, the race that has been held since 1923, with some exceptions, has seen many brands and drivers come and go, and the event is as popular now as it's ever been, because of the newer hypercar class bringing so many much-loved manufacturers together, and that list is going to grow over the next few years. Yesterday, in Hyperpole, Alex Lynn's Jota Cadillac took the fastest lap honours, with the other Cadillac of Jenson Button, Sebastian Bourdais and Earl Bamber in second. It was a result so hectic that not even Jota could believe that they'd done it, using a meme from the Grand Tour to express their shock. And yes, I know what you're seeing here is a Jota Porsche, not a Cadillac. Le Mans Ultimate is still stuck in 2024. But this is the thing about Le Mans. We can moan and cry and whine and start slagging the FIA and ACO off from behind our keyboards, when it comes to balance of performance. But this is just qualifying. Qualifying in a 24-hour race doesn't really matter, because anything can happen in that time, and endurance racing is about survival more than just hooning it around. Fuel saved early on means shorter pit stops at the end if things work out right. And yes, they are saving fuel. Any of these, at least they're not tyre saving or fuel saving like in Formula 1, rah, is talking out of their, well, derriere, since we're on about Le Mans. And that's what's great about Le Mans, not knowing who is going to win. It's all part of the fun. Like at Bathurst, the track chooses who wins. In 2016 we had that Toyota breakdown, and in 2017 we had all the LMP1s run into issues, so that it was an LMP2 owned by Jackie Chan that almost won the race instead. Yeah, I know, Jackie Chan. How cool is that? There's also a McLaren 720S in British GT sponsored by Ainsley Harriott. Spicy. But the 11th of June 2025 was not just the 30th anniversary of one of the most popular wins in Formula 1 history, it was also the 70th anniversary of the day that motor racing as a whole almost finished. Now, as a bit of a disclaimer, this video will probably get heavy in places. We're talking about the worst thing to ever happen in motorsport, but it's important that we keep to the facts, and we talk about what happened. It might seem excessive what I'm talking about, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen, because, well, it did happen, and we shouldn't forget it, nor should we sugarcoat it. In my videos, I tend to give all the details, or as much of the details as I possibly can give you, as I've done in the Jock and Rindt video, and also the Dan Weldon video, so this one will be no different. So, the year is 1955. Motorsport is in an era of rebirth following the Second World War, with the FIA creating the Formula 1 World Championship and holding its first race in the May of 1950, and Formula 1 is having their own celebrations regarding all of that. Celebrations I had the privilege of being a part of, it has to be said. It was the era of Italian dominance, with Ferrari, Maserati and Alfa Romeo being the big three of racing in Europe at that time, but there was now starting to be competition from elsewhere. The Garagistas, as they were known, were still a little way away from hitting their stride. Vanwall was in Formula 1 at this time, but they weren't doing every round. BRM weren't around yet, nor were Lotus. Cooper did only round 6 of that Formula 1 season in 1955. But looking at the entry list for Formula 1 at that time, you needed to be in an Italian car to be doing well. But also on that list was the Silver Arrows of Mercedes, and they'd been coming in to spoil the Italian party. But it really was a stacked era for drivers. You take one look at the 1955 entry list for Formula 1 and you'll see Fangio, Moss, Salvadori, Collins, Brabham, who did round 6 at Silverstone, Gonzalez, Trintignant, Schell, Hawthorne, Farina and Ascari, although Ascari would be tragically killed at Monza testing a Ferrari. But this was the 1950s. If they were running in one series, the chances were they were running in another series at the same time. Mike Hawthorne was one of those drivers. In Formula 1 he was driving for Enzo Ferrari, but for the 1955 edition of the 24 Hours of Le Mans he was driving for Jaguar, who were one of the 3 teams in contention for the win that year. Ferrari, Jaguar and Mercedes had all won the race at some point, and all 3 manufacturers had gone all out to try and secure the victory at one of the 3 biggest races of the year. The other 2 being Monaco and Indianapolis, but there was also the Mille Miglia and Targa Florio. Ferrari were the reigning champions of Le Mans and had the 735 LM as their main weapon, but it was the Lotus of its era. very fast, but also very fragile. It apparently had lesser aero and braking performance versus the 375 that preceded it, all because Enzo had had one of those stick a bigger engine in it moments. Mercedes meanwhile had the 300 SLR, an absolutely beautiful car that was designed to be a sporty lightweight racer, hence SLR, and was powered by a 3-litre straight 8 engine that had already won the 1955 Mille and had won 5 of the 6 races it had entered that year, Le Mans being the 6th. It also had 2 seats that could house a mechanic, navigator or co-driver depending on what the race was. It's a really cool car, all things considered. And then there was Jaguar, who had brought the D-Type, and Hawthorne was in one of those cars. A 3.5 litre straight 6 was under the bonnet of this thing, and all round it's an absolute stunner. But there's any number of adjectives to describe this thing. A work of art is probably my go-to for it. Jaguar had concentrated solely on Le Mans for this year, and the lads from the Midlands had designed this car to be as slippery as possible, adding a stabiliser that was not seen on Formula 1 cars until 2008. But out of all 3 of those manufacturers, it was expected that Mercedes would win with the 300 SLR. The Ferrari was fast but fragile, but the Jaguar didn't have that extra 1%. Either way, this was one of the most hotly anticipated Le Mans in a long time, because the driver lineups were as follows. This also being the days of 2 drivers per team, with 3 drivers per team not really being a thing until the 80s. The lead Mercedes was driven by Stirling Moss and Juan Manuel Fangio, which for the time is like putting prime Lewis Hamilton and prime Michael Schumacher in the same car. Another Mercedes was driven by Carl Kling and André Simon, with the third driven by Pierre Levegh, real name Pierre Bouillin, and John Fitch. One Jaguar was driven by Mike Hawthorne and Ivor Webb, with a second car for 1953 Le Mans winners Tony Rolt and Duncan Hamilton. And then you had the 3 Ferraris, one driven by Eugenio Castellotti and Paolo Marzotto. Then you had Maurice Trintignant and Harry Schell, and Umberto Maglioli and Phil Hill. So a decent amount of talent behind the wheels. And also a fun fact about Pierre Levegh, a few years prior to this edition of the race, he tried to solo the entire 24 hours, and almost won, but his car broke down not far from the end. So the race started, the drivers running to their cars, getting in, firing them up and driving away, as was the tradition at the time. But it would be replaced by the rolling start at the start of the 70s. Castellotti in the Ferrari took the early advantage, leading the first lap, while Hawthorne in the Jaguar was close behind. Fangio meanwhile had made a slow getaway because he'd snagged his trousers on his gear shifter somehow and was late getting off the line. Fangio did manage to make his way up through the field, and by lap 4, the top 8 was made up of the 8 cars from the 3 manufacturers that were expected to do well. On lap 5, they started to lap the slower classes, and a Nardi was blown into a ditch by the dirty air coming off the back of the faster cars. The Ferraris and the Jaguars were going hell for leather, and were separated by not much at all. But with an hour gone, Castellotti made a mistake, and that let Hawthorne and one of the Mercedes through. The first pit stops were due at around lap 35, which seems inconceivable today because the ACO, FIA, whoever's doing the rule making for Le Mans, limits the cars to around 10-11 laps of fuel before they must make a pit stop. So by this point, the cars had been out for over 2 hours, which is, well, a very long time, and also the layout of Le Mans was a little bit different, which we'll get to in a second. But it's around these first pit stops just after 6 o'clock that tragedy struck. There was a little bit of an S-bend at Maison Blanche, but it was pretty much flat out up there. No Fords, no Porsches, no pit wall. That would not be installed until 1970. Now what you're seeing here is how it was, although disclaimer, this is a 1967 version of the circuit. The cars would fly up that pit straight and would slam on their brakes and pull into their pit boxes. The slowdown lane wasn't there. I've commentated on historic Le Mans in sim racing, and it's hard enough to do in those video games, so how they did it in those days, with it being sometimes in the wet, sometimes at night, or both, is unfathomable to us in 2025. Miss your box while low on fuel? You're done. Lose control, you crash, or worse, you hit one of your crew or somebody else's crew. But that's just how it was back then. Hawthorne had just put a lap on Levegh's Mercedes, and he was racing Fangio for the lead like there were only 22 minutes left on the clock rather than 22 hours. Hawthorne was now actually leading and was determined to get away from Fangio as much as possible. Because, in his own words, why should a German car beat a British one? And we'll get back to that mentality in a bit. As the 2 cars came out of Maison Blanche, they quickly approached an Austin Healey 100S, driven by Lance Macklin. Hawthorne overtook Macklin, with Lance moving over slightly to the right to allow the faster car's passage on the left. But once the Jaguar had cleared the Austin, Hawthorne raised his hand to indicate that he was coming into the pits and slammed on his brakes. The thing is, the pit lane was all the way over there. Hawthorne was over here. So when he slammed on the brakes, he had to move back across in front of the Austin, and that's how the tragedy happened. The Jaguar had disc brakes, which were incredibly powerful and gave the Jaguar a little bit of an edge. The Austin was still on drum brakes, and as Hawthorne got on his brakes, Macklin didn't have much time to react. When Macklin braked, he veered to the left to avoid Hawthorne because the Jaguar was slowing down much faster than the Austin could. Veering to the left prevented the collision with the Jaguar, but it ended up making things worse, although Macklin wasn't to know it at the time. Some sources say the move was instinct to prevent a crash with Hawthorne. Some say it was because he'd cooked the brakes and the car pulled to the left. The sharp move to the left and the slowing down put the Austin directly in front of Levegh's Mercedes, which was now closing in much faster because of Macklin slamming on the brakes to avoid Hawthorne. Now it was Levegh's turn to be caught out, and Pierre raised his hand to indicate to Fangio, who was waiting to pass his teammate, that something was wrong. Fangio closed his eyes and through sheer good fortune made it past Macklin's car, which had now been hit by Levegh. That raising of his hand was probably the last action that Pierre Levegh ever made. Here is a graphic reconstruction of what happened that's been uploaded to Wikipedia. Hawthorne in green passes the blue Austin on the left before diving into the pits. Macklin moves left while on the brakes and Levegh hits the Austin, with Fangio passing relatively unscathed through the chaos, although he did brush past the stationary Jaguar that had now made it into the pits, although Hawthorne had overshot his box. Fangio was able to continue, but behind him the worst accident in motor racing history was unfolding. Levegh's car had ridden up the rear quarter of the Austin Healey, launching it upwards into the air for around 80 metres or so. The part of the track this contact had occurred on was a kink in the road, which meant that the Mercedes was now on a straight line towards the crowds on the left-hand side of the circuit, and the Mercedes ended up barrelling into that crowd as the car disintegrated. The crowd back then was incredibly close to the action, and there was no catch fencing, and only straw bales being the only thing to cushion the blow. If a car got air and went off to one side, it was going to land in one place, and one place only. The engine, radiator and front suspension assembly flew off and killed any spectator that was unfortunate enough to be standing in the way. Meanwhile, the bonnet had flown off with such momentum that it was decapitating members of the crowd. Levegh, meanwhile, was killed instantly when the car hit the ground. When the car finally came to a stop, it burst into flames, but it was about to get much worse. Mercedes had built the car out of a material they called electron, which was a magnesium alloy. So when the car exploded, the magnesium in that alloy was taken beyond its ignition temperature, and much like the Honda driven by Joe Schlesser at the 1968 French Grand Prix, the car as a whole burst into a white-hot ball of flame. The fire crews, not experienced with this kind of thing, tried to douse the flames with water, which only aggravated the fire. Hawthorne had gotten out of his car, with Jaguar saying do another lap to get him round again. When Hawthorne got back, he was left utterly distraught as to what had happened. Ivor Webb got into the car and did his stint, although he was incredibly reluctant to. Meanwhile, Levegh's wife was standing in the pits and she saw the whole thing unfold, with her husband's lifeless and burned body lying in full view until a gendarme covered the body with a banner. John Fitch, Levegh's co-driver, then ran to a telephone to call his family back in the United States so they could know that it wasn't him driving the car. The Manchester Guardian newspaper, now simply The Guardian, reported at the time, 2 young boys were decapitated, one next to his dying father. His mother, blood coming from a gashed arm, screamed as she clutched the mutilated body to her. The packed enclosure along the grandstand straight was a terrible scene. Hundreds of spectators went to help the rescue teams, police and firemen. A priest moved slowly among the dying, while volunteers covered the bodies with newspapers and torn clothing. Levegh, killed instantly, was dragged from the blazing wreckage of his car, and other bodies were carried away on stretchers and ladders. Most of the dead were French, but a police list of dead included the name of Jack Diamond, aged 24, of London, and Robert John Loxley, aged 24, of Worcester. 2 British are among the injured, Mr. W.T. Saunders of Rugby and Mr. John Chapman, whose address was not given. Jacques Lalonde, a spectator that survived, later said to the paper once released from hospital, There was a terrific explosion and 2 car wheels whistled over my head. I saw a little girl in a light-coloured dress who had been trampled on by panic-stricken spectators, lying in a pool of blood. A piece of metal hit me square on the forehead, and I saw a headless man beside me collapse like a rag doll. But the race was not stopped, and those who were there were expecting it to be stopped. But the race director, Charles Farreau, let things continue, saying that if they cancelled the race and told everybody what had happened, it would cause mass panic, and everybody trying to leave the circuit would have caused bottlenecks, and that would prevent emergency vehicles from reaching those that needed help. He was also worried about being sued by competitors and firms that had invested in the race, as well as saying that he didn't have the authority to stop the race at all, that being the authority of Pierre Levegh. There was also the unwritten rule of the time that was the show must go on, and the 1952 Farnborough Air Show had been cited in that show must go on mantra when a prototype fighter jet crashed, and they still carried on the show. But there was also a historical element to all of this. Once again, a battle between the British and the Germans had resulted in the deaths of many innocent French civilians. Remember, this was 1955. Just over 11 years prior, France had been a literal battlefield and had been under enemy occupation. Ivor Webb was in the Royal Air Force during the war, and most of the Mercedes engineers had been part of the German war effort. There had been whispers of Mercedes' reasons for withdrawing being to save a bit of face, in light of, quote, recent unpleasantness. The conspiracy, if you want to call it that the Germans could not be seen to win where so many French people had been killed. Jaguar, meanwhile, declined to withdraw because it had taken Mercedes 6 hours to make their decision, and they basically just went, well, you've taken this long to make your decision to withdraw, we're going to carry on if that's alright. Mercedes got the call from Stuttgart approving their withdrawal from the race later that evening. The 2 remaining cars were quietly withdrawn just before 2 AM, and the team was gone by the time the sun had come up. Before withdrawing, Mercedes head engineer Rudolf Uhlenhaut had spoken to his counterpart at Jaguar, Lofty England, and asked if Jaguar would join them, but Jaguar elected to stay because of the reasons I've already given. With the Mercedes cars gone and the Ferraris running into issues, the Jaguars continued unopposed. Hawthorn and Webb won the race by 5 laps from Aston Martin. After the race, Hawthorn was pictured smiling with a bottle of champagne. The French newspapers who blamed Hawthorn for the crash published a highly sarcastic headline of, "Cheers, Mr. Hawthorn." Hawthorn would die in a car accident just after winning the Formula 1 title in 1958, and ironically, it was after overtaking a Mercedes in his Jaguar, although it's thought that a pre-existing kidney condition caused him to black out, which led to the crash. It's thought 80 people plus Levegh were killed, although other sources put the number a lot higher, into triple figures in some cases. But it doesn't matter if it was 80 people, 81 people, 120 people, it's still the most devastating accident in motorsport history, and it had a major knock-on effect for the next, 70 years. In France, Spain, West Germany and other countries around the world, a temporary ban was placed on hosting motorsport events. The bans in West Germany and France were lifted once it was deemed that the safety standards at tracks had been increased, but in Switzerland, the ban remained into effect until 2022. Those jokes that you heard on Top Gear about the Swiss hating cars and having ultra-sensitive speed cameras, that's all because of this accident. Although the ban had partially been lifted in 2015, but the ban was lifted for electric vehicles only. In the United States, USAC was formed to take over the sanctioning of the Indy 500 from the American Automobile Association. The World Sports Car Championship season was completed, but the race at the Nürburgring was cancelled. They had 2 rounds run at Dundrod and the Targa Florio, but these races happened later in the year as the authorities figured out what to do. Mercedes won both events, and then pulled out of motorsport after also completing that year's Formula 1 World Championship. While a lot of people will cite the 1955 Le Mans disaster as being the reason Mercedes pulled out of motorsport for around 30 years or so, they were actually intending to pull out anyway, and this just happened to happen in that same time period. I didn't know that. But there were a lot of fingers being pointed at who was to blame. Macklin and the French media blamed Hawthorn for overtaking on the left and then slamming on the brakes, while the race organisers accused Mercedes of using illegal additives in their fuel, which made the fires burn the way they did. Mercedes denied this, telling the organisers to test the fuel residue on Levegh's car. When nothing was found, Mercedes were excused. Hawthorn later wrote a book where he denied all responsibility for the accident, and Macklin later sued Hawthorn for defamation when he thought that Hawthorn was blaming Macklin for the crash. But Hawthorn died before it could all go to court. After an investigation that took around 12 months or so, it was deemed to be one big catastrophic accident and no driver was to blame. Although over the course of the investigation, drivers, engineers and people who were there were asked to give evidence and testify to the committee, and the deaths of the spectators were deemed because of lack of safety standards at the circuit. Although Tony Rolt and other drivers had been saying as early as 1953 that that pit straight was not wide enough. But the circuit did change slightly for 1956. The pit complex was demolished and the straight widened to allow for a deceleration lane, although like mentioned it would take another 15 years or so for an actual wall to be placed there. And even then, the track wasn't that much wider than it was in 1955. The kink where Levegh hit Macklin was removed and it was straightened out, and the entry list reduced from 60 cars to 52, which I think is still the limit today, I'm not sure. It's definitely a higher number than other WEC races. While safety had been largely an afterthought in this era, now there was a conscious effort to start improving things, but it was still slow. While there had been this initial large effort following 1955, after that it was incredibly slow and still regarded as being bare minimum. It would still not be until around 1967-1968, after the deaths of Jim Clark and Lorenzo Bandini, that everything started to be pushed even harder, led by Jackie Stewart and the GPDA in Formula 1. Today, safety is much, much, much better, but there have been some close calls in recent memory, such as Austin Dillon's massive shunt at Daytona where he ended up in the catch fencing, as well as Zhou Guanyu's crash at Silverstone in 2022 where he too got incredibly close to the catch fencing. With the safety standards of 2025, something has to go completely wrong all at once for tragedy to occur. But for this particular day in the June of 1955, it changed motorsport forever. But at the same time, it could have also ended it. Thanks very much for watching. I've been Aidan Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.